Good afternoon. I'm Allison McKinney-Tim, founder and executive director of Justice Revival. We are partnering today with the Forum on Human Rights at the Carter Center to bring you this roundtable conversation, Human Rights Accountability for Systemic Racism in U.S. Policing. Just over 2 months ago, the world witnessed on viral video yet another killing of an unarmed African-American individual by police. George Floyd cried out for help, pleading, "I can't breathe," while the white Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin held his knee on Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes, ultimately taking Floyd's life. This followed in the wake of numerous similar cases highly publicized in recent years. It also came in the context of a public health crisis that has disproportionately claimed Black lives. Floyd's death sparked outrage in the US and around the world, prompting transnational protests of striking intensity, scope, and duration. The brother of George Floyd has testified not only before the US Congress, but also before a United Nations human rights body, as did the mother of Michael Brown some years ago. And here to consider the human rights implications of these cases and the many others like them, we have an esteemed panel of expert guest speakers. Let me start by introducing our panel. Nicole Austin Hillary, who will be joining our conversation in progress, who's not yet with us. She is the inaugural executive director of the US program at Human Rights Watch. She leads the organization's efforts to end rights violations in the US criminal system and to challenge racial discrimination in the United States. Ms. Austin Hillary previously served as the first director and counsel of the Brennan Center's Washington, D.C. office. Professor Justin Hansford is the executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Center for Civil Rights and professor of law at Howard University School of Law. His scholarship and activism focus on critical race theory, human rights, and law and social movements. In response to the killing of Michael Brown, Professor Hansford co-authored a human rights report entitled Ferguson to Geneva and accompanied Brown's family to testify before the UN. And finally, Professor Gay McDougall is Senior Fellow and Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the Leitner Center for International Justice and the Center for Race, Law, and Justice at Fordham University School of Law. For 8 years, she was a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. She stepped down in December as vice chair. Professor McDougall co-wrote the recent letter calling for a special session of the UN Human Rights Council to address systemic racism in law enforcement and the harsh response to protests that followed George Floyd's killing. And welcome and thank you again to our very esteemed panel of guests. Let's start with the story that has riveted the nation and gripped the world, the story of George Floyd's death. Gay McDougall, I'd like to ask you, some 7 years into the burgeoning Black Lives Matter movement, why do you think George Floyd's death in particular has resonated so powerfully, not just in the United States, but around the world?
Well, I think the short answer is that video. It's going viral around the world. The sight of someone being executed for over 8.5 minutes, the casual look on the face of his executioner, it shocked the conscience of the world. And I think it left no doubt about the injustice that was carried out on him.
Justin Hansford, let me ask you, to what extent was the killing of George Floyd a distinctive or unique case, and to what extent was it emblematic of a long-standing pattern in the United States?
It was unique in the sense of it being captured so distinctly visually, and also happening in the midst of a global pandemic, which created a much wider audience for this particular visual. Actually, of course, on my mind is the John Lewis Memorial, which we saw yesterday. And I was reading a bit about that, and people were talking about how when Bloody Sunday took place, it just so happened that there was a huge television event. Actually, interestingly enough, in the tradition of the international human rights jurisdictional inter-American human rights analysis, it was the judgment at Nuremberg that was being shown on Bloody Sunday, and people who were already tuned in, millions of people who were tuned in looking at human rights abuse, were redirected to pictures of John Lewis and others on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and that audience was then redirected to a harsh visual that shocked the conscience and led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I couldn't help but think of the parallel here, where you have a sort of another captive audience seeing this video, having their conscience shocked in a way that perhaps if the country was running normally, people would not be at home watching this video to the same degree. So I do think there are some unique circumstances that are echoed throughout history that creates a larger audience and then expands the outrage.
I would just add to that it was emblematic in that it was so much like many things that have gone before that did not have the same level of public witness, if you will. Going all the way back into the killing of Black men in slavery, and the lynchings that went on during the Jim Crow era. Another thing that, was brought to my mind watching the funeral yesterday, Justin, was that John Lewis said that the murder of Emmett Till, which was a Black kid who was murdered in the 1950s, like 1960s in Mississippi, was his George Floyd, that it was the trigger that started his activism. And I remember that murder because it was his mother insisted on having an open casket. And the one, the one publication that all of African America read was Jet Magazine. And I remember the pictures in Jet Magazine, and it was as shocking as the, the viral video of George Floyd.
Mm-hmm. So these cases stand within the context of this long history of violence against Black bodies, African-American men and women in the United States. And yet there are these moments that have been unique in how we're able to bear witness to what's actually been happening. Tell me, Gay McDougall, why is it significant to think about the killing of George Floyd or Michael Brown or Emmett Till from the perspective of a human rights violation as compared to framing it within our domestic civil rights framework?
Well, I would say this. For ordinary people, ordinary Americans that care, I think they see the term human rights as referring to a legal order having a higher status and of an enduring quality that allows no exceptions. I mean, these are rules that are universal and for the common good of all humanity. That's saying it in a very structured way, but I think it just immediately says that to people. While, I see the term civil rights as being part and parcel of human rights. But I think most Americans would say civil rights, yes, are about laws that are subject to change by lawmakers, and that they are not comprehensive with respect to justice. And I think the sense is that human rights are.
Justin Hansford, would you weigh in on this?
Sure. From a technical legal perspective, the substance of civil rights and human rights are different. Under our Constitution, we have certain rights that are not just political rights. A lot of times when people think about civil rights, they think about political rights, meaning the right to vote and things of that nature. That's a very technical way of looking at that term. But even if you think about in a broader constitutional sense, Gay can tell you how in order to prove discrimination, for example, under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, you must prove that the discrimination was intentional. You have to prove intent, which is a very high bar to reach. Almost impossible. Somebody would have to be willing to say that they are now discriminating as they discriminate or something of that nature. But under the human rights interpretation of discrimination, you can use something called disparate impact theory, meaning that if you show the disparity, the intent is understood. So I think in that sense, human rights is, I believe, has a more coherent understanding of racism than our Constitution does. And, and of course, the other thing about human rights is that it is not limited to the political realities of a particular time and place. It is a question of principle. We have a human right to housing. We know that there are many people who are homeless in the United States, and that's completely constitutional because there's no civil right to housing for everybody. We have a human right to have access to healthy food. We have these fundamental human rights to dignity, human rights to be free from, unsanitary incarceration conditions. So human rights have an aspirational quality that civil rights and constitutional rights deny. And so the realm of human rights is one of the reasons I'm involved in work that I call human rights lawyering work, because for someone who has an aspiration to try to create justice in the world, it makes much more sense to aspire to fulfill our human rights as opposed to sort of being willing to settle for the lower standards that from a legal perspective are represented in the civil rights jurisprudence. I just want to add one caveat. I know many people advocate for civil rights and they don't use this technical language. So civil rights to them means something aspirational approaching human rights. So I want to I want to acknowledge that. I don't want to say that everyone who uses the term civil rights for civil rights activism or civil rights lawyering is sort of settling for these lower standard terms. But as an attorney who thinks about this from a really overly technical perspective, human rights are the things that I want to aspire to, not civil rights.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about, staying with the George Floyd case for a moment, thinking about that, let's say from a human rights perspective, Justin, let me stay with you. Could you walk us through or name what are the key relevant rights at issue in a case of excessive police force, lethal force, Can you just orient us to some of the rights at issue and some of their legal foundations?
Certainly. So from a human rights perspective, in the same way that we saw in the Mike Brown case, which I worked on with a number of activists from Ferguson, and when we put together something called Ferguson to Geneva, there's the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or degrading treatments or punishment. It's called the CAT Convention. So this was a treaty entered into under the Reagan administration, which says that essentially the United States will not engage in torture. And I don't think it's hard for people to understand how what the government did to George Floyd, and to be clear, the police officers are the government. It would have been illegal for him to fight back. And what they were doing was torturing him unto the point of, him losing his life. And so that would be a clear violation of that agreement if you were to think about the Convention Against Torture. And in most police violence, remember, we're always talking about government interactions with the citizens of their country. When they use violence in these ways, it's torturing people in the same way you would think of conventionally when governments torture political dissidents or people of that nature. It's the same principle at hand, even more so when that torture is based not on necessarily political beliefs or any sort of something that might be wrong, but at least there's some sort of thinking behind it. Here, when it's based on race, we talk about that. We use the language of arbitrariness to articulate what is happening. It's an arbitrary use of force, and so that even enhances the illegality of the action. The other treaties, I'm hesitant to even mention this because I have the expert here to talk in more detail.
Well,
the Convention Against Individual
Gay.
Discrimination is CERD, and Gay McDougall is the person to talk about that because she is the leader of that convention in my mind around the world. But
that's
that
a good
goes
segue.
More depth. Mm-hmm. It's a good segue.
Thank you for explaining about the CAT, a term, torture, a frame we don't often hear domestically around these issues, a unique insight. And Gay, to you, to talk about the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination.
This is one of the three human rights treaties that the U.S. has ratified. Unfortunately, it's 3 out of many that have not been ratified, but it's a very important one, a key one with respect to all of these cases of unauthorized and shootings of Black males and others, not just Black males, Black women. It lays out a very comprehensive definition of what is racial discrimination, much more so than you would find in US laws. But it also goes on to a lot of positive, affirmative duties that governments have to make sure that there's not a climate in which racial discrimination can take hold and flourish and be, the driving force behind many other abuses. And the thing about all of these cases of police shootings is that clearly you've got these shootings are based on racial discrimination, either directly in terms of orders from the chain of command, because the thing about George Floyd is that he had a squad leader standing right there in front of the policeman who had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, who was instructing him. So there was, this wasn't just a aberrant act, but the thing that is very disturbing is that there's a pattern and practice of these shootings of Black, unarmed people. And there is a pattern and practice that indicates that it's based on racial discrimination. And I think that if you look at some of the videos in all of these cases, I mean, in every one of the cases, the videos are online, by the way, highly disturbing. And I think it's hard to walk away from them without making a conclusion that there's something that is wrong here, that's beyond what happened, that in the policemen who have acted, there is a sense of, what shall I say, hatred, and a sense of being, it all being so casual, what they have done to these other human beings. And, so it's really so very difficult to not conclude that it is a matter of racial discrimination. Let me say, however, that in addition, the UN has a whole series of guidelines for policing, for use of force, authorization of use of force in certain, what are the conditions upon which force should be used or not be used by police, what's required, what kinds of justifications, et cetera. And, when you look at these, guidelines, it is so clear that the actions of the police in these situations have been out of gear with these requirements. Also, how they have treated protesters that have been in the streets. So go ahead.
I wanted to acknowledge that Nicole Austin Hillary has joined us, and welcome Nicole to the conversation. And maybe we could pivot to you, Nicole. We've been talking about some of the international human rights standards relevant to a case of lethal police force against an unarmed Black man like George Floyd. We've talked about the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and then Gay has just mentioned other international standards pertaining to police use of force. From your perspective, in your work at Human Rights Watch, how is the US doing generally? Is it making progress towards better complying with those international standards?
Well, first of all, Allison, let me thank you for inviting me to be a part of this esteemed panel today. Gay, it's good to see you. Justin, it's good to see you. I feel like there's all these interconnections between us.
Yes.
I'm a Howard person, a Howard Law grad, and Gay has been a leader and a heroine really in this community for so long. So I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you.
And I apologize for joining you all late, but let me just say, this is a busy day for justice.
Yeah.
The reason I joined late is because we just released a report this morning at Human Rights Watch on the impact of probation and parole on Black and brown people and how it is being used to continually subjugate these communities and all the interconnections there are between probation and parole and people's lack of access to housing and education and to the vote and all the things that we know about. So I was late, but for a good reason, because the lawyer's work is just ongoing. Let me say this, Gay has clearly just articulated all of the very specific treaties and laws that we need to be relying on from a human rights perspective. But I have to tell you, and Gay, you and I have talked about this. One of the biggest things I think we have to do in the United States right now is this, which is underscore that inextricable link between human rights and civil rights. But everyone on the tips of everyone's lips right now is a conversation about civil rights and how the beatings and the killings are all about civil rights violations. But I want to remind people the day after the amazing funeral for Congressman John Lewis, that what he reminded us all of is the fact that rights are global.
Yes.
It's just about what we understand to be civil rights in the United States. It's about human rights, and civil rights are encompassed under this umbrella that we call, civil rights are encompassed under the human rights umbrella. And it's one of the spokes. So I think one of the biggest things we have to do right now to really try to give more teeth to the international laws that we rely upon is to help educate about that link and to get people talking about that link and messaging around it. We should not be having conversations that are only talking about civil rights. We should be having conversations that put it into this global context of human rights. Because what we see going on around the world right now, it's not just about what happened in the United States. It was a catalyst. But we see people from disenfranchised and from discounted communities all over the globe standing up right now saying this is a fight about rights and equitable rights for people around the globe. So I really think in addition to looking at those specific laws that we can rely upon, that we have to change the framing for how we talk about this work and these issues. And I think that's going to be a big game changer. And I think that's what's going to help to buoy the strength and the efficacy of the international human rights treaties that we have all relied upon for so long, but for whom many people in the United States, for instance, don't really focus on because they've never thought about it as one of the arsenals or as one of the tools in their arsenal for fighting back against these injustices.
Absolutely.
Nicole,
I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Nicole was with us in spirit at the top of the hour, because in part that's where we started, and we had some remarks on the enduring universal appeal, the broad moral appeal, the broader umbrella of human rights. And Gay, you were saying?
Well, I just wanted to say that Nicole is absolutely right. Of course, I've been on that one message since 1995 and, sort of crisscrossing the country, talking to people about that. And I think that one of the, incredible things that has happened partly as a result of that is the development of the U.S. Human Rights Network, which is a network of human rights workers on the ground in communities across the country. And when, I got involved in taking this matter of George Floyd's murder to get the UN Human Rights Council to take it up, one of the really incredibly great parts of the coalition that I was working with was that network of groups that would have just called themselves community organizers. But, as a consequence of this message over the years, began to think, well, yeah, I'm a human rights advocate. And then people like Justin took some of them to the UN to testify before the torture committee, et cetera. So it's been building. It's unfortunate that it's a very slow process. And
I'm so glad that you raised both of those events, and I'd love to probe into both of those, both Justin's work with the mother of Michael Brown, and then the more recent work that you did, Gabe, with before the UN Human Rights Council. But Justin, let's pass this over to you. Can you tell us about your experience riding Ferguson to Geneva, advocating with activists and with Leslie McFadden, Michael Brown's mother, in Geneva. Why was that important to you?
It was the most meaningful project I've worked on in my legal career. When I was putting together the shadow report, what we do is they call them shadow reports, and it's a document that you put together and submit, which allows you to testify before these committees. And I was already involved in Ferguson. I'd been arrested protesting and things of that nature. But to put together this document, I had to interview protesters who had been brutalized by the police. I had to interview folks who had just come out of jail from protesting. I had to interview the family, and I had to. It's a very interesting story. You know, I didn't know them before I put together this project, and I had to go to the family's church a few times and and sit in the pews and, you know, gain trust. But eventually I did get a chance to meet them, and I can continue to be very blessed to be able to be a supporter and advisor for the family and the work that they're doing now 6 years later. But in that process, though, all of my legal skills came to bear. I had to prepare them for their testimony in the same way I would prepare a witness for testimony in regular law practice. We had to raise money and go to Geneva. And, you know, it was one of the most moving experiences I ever had to see Mike Brown's mother testify before that committee. You know, people had their little earphones in so they could listen in 20 or 30 different languages. And she got a chance to tell her story. It seems like the courts here in the United States are not going to allow her to tell her story. We know that there was no civil trial. And just yesterday we heard from another prosecutor that there won't be a criminal trial in the killing of Mike Brown. So this is her only chance to speak before any official body as a family member and tell her side of the story. And it was very meaningful to her. It meant the world to her. She finally had a voice, and she finally got recognized. Her dignity was recognized. And it says a lot that she had to go all the way to Geneva, Switzerland, to be able to have her day in court, so to speak. But my role in being able to facilitate that through the human rights mechanism is, to this day, the most meaningful thing that I've done as a lawyer. And so, you know, it's an interesting question around. Another thing I wanted to mention was the usefulness of it. Since many people, I'm sure we can talk about this later as well, but many people will contrast human rights to civil rights in the sense that civil rights are enforceable directly in American courts. If you win a civil rights case, there's a damages claim that you may be able to immediately enforce, or some sort of penalty that you can enforce. Human rights seem to be less enforceable directly. But you know, there are intrinsic benefits, spiritual benefits, moral benefits, but even tangible benefits. You know, after the trip to the UN, we came back and people were interviewing the Ferguson police chief, and they were interviewing the mayor of Ferguson, the governor of Missouri, telling them, "Hey, these people went to the United Nations. What do you have to say about that?" And they were like, no comment, you know, at the time. But, you know, our research shows that behind the scenes, they were aware of the international attention that was being put on the case. And later on in November, when there was the first decision not to indict Darren Wilson, the decision was made to prioritize people over property. In other words, not to go as hard in trying to use violence against the protesters, because they were worried about the consequences internationally, and they were thinking about the ability for them to possibly have the United Nations watching and giving them a hard time, probably for political reasons.
So what's happening in Geneva could resonate right there in the prosecutor's office in Ferguson.
And it's, you know, it's political. And I study something called critical race theory, which, you know, one of the principles of it, you know, in addition to talking about race in the context of the law, we talk about how the fact that all of this is political. Law is political. If it's international law or if it's domestic law, there were political reasons, for example, why this prosecutor decided not to bring charges against Mike Brown's killer. Simply the local police union is too strong. The local police union has been very aggressive in making life miserable for Kim Gardner, who is a city prosecutor in St. Louis, who has uncovered police corruption. And the prosecutor in the Michael Brown case said, you know, I want to go up for re-election. I can't afford to make them my enemies right now, so I'm not going to bring charges. So what I mean to say by that is that in reality, whether or not the law works on your behalf is always political. So this idea that there's some sort of neutral mechanism in civil rights that you can easily enforce because you won the case, and that's better than the human rights mechanism, that's false, because you need political dynamics to be on your side locally in the civil rights case, in the same way you need political dynamics to be on your side internationally in a human rights case. And sometimes your win on the human rights level will have more political force than you do if you were to use a regular, you know, civil or criminal mechanism in the state or city where you happen to reside because of the political dynamics. So you could say that we got more tangible gains from the international human rights hearing than we did from either the criminal court or the civil court in the state of Missouri. You could say that. And so for people who think that, you know, the human rights mechanisms are useless because they're not directly enforceable, I think they misunderstand the role of politics in any type of process of justice.
I'm so glad you explained that so thoroughly, because that's actually a question that I get frequently doing community human rights education. If human rights aren't enforceable directly in the same way as domestic law, how do they become useful? And you really just illuminated that in a way that that I hadn't heard articulated like that before. And on a very related note, so back to Gay McDougall talking about Phyllis Floyd testifying before the Human Rights Council. You played a key role in making that happen by co-writing the letter that gained support of some 690 civil society organizations petitioning for an urgent debate to take up these issues of systemic racism and in policing, as well as the harsh response to protesters. Tell us about the significance of that hearing and the results that followed.
Well, I think that it was hugely influential, certainly at the UN. It was not exactly what we asked for, but then you always ask for more than you believe you could get. But I think what we got was still unprecedented. An urgent debate, which is a term of art at the UN, has only happened 3 times previously. Twice with respect to Syria and the other with respect to Gaza. So first of all, to have an urgent debate with respect to the United States, a human rights issue in the United States, was really very, very important. And part of it was that the US has been very effective over the years in hallway lobbying to dissuade government representatives from other countries who would make the decisions ultimately from mentioning the US in any way, or human rights problems in the US in any way. So this was a very important thing that happened. And also the resolution that came out, while again, it was not what we wanted, it was not as strong as we wanted, but there have been very few resolutions in the coming out of any of the UN bodies, except the what we call expert bodies, like treaty bodies, et cetera, that even mention the UN, the US.
And what does the resolution call for? What does it require?
Well, it requires the, well, first of all, it does mention the violations of human rights that occurred in the US in terms of the George Floyd thing, the treatment of protesters by police, and of media people who were covering the protests. It then calls on the High Commissioner for Human Rights to do a report on these matters that will be presented over the next 3 or 4 sessions of the Human Rights Council, which gives this a life beyond just a one-off. We were unhappy that it did not include resources, extra resources, to do a thorough investigation. So we now have sent a letter to the High Commissioner trying to urge that she does such an investigation. There will be special rapporteurs included, and that would be very, in doing the report, and that would be very important. But again, without the kind of resources that would support a real outreach to witnesses and that sort of thing, it would be hard, but it will nevertheless be unprecedented. You know, this urgent debate is something that has been the call by US NGOs going all the way back to the beginning of the UN when W.B. Du Bois tried to get a special session on the US and human rights abuses against African Americans. So this was that unprecedented and important.
And at that time, his appeal was, I understand, rebuffed at the early UN.
It was rebuffed, but it was buried, I think is maybe the right way to put it, by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was at the time the head of the US delegation working on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also happened to be on the board of the NAACP, which is the organization that W.B. Du Bois was there representing. So I think that, and in that case, as in the case of George Floyd and the initiative that we worked on, the US, sort of gets its way by threatening the representatives of other countries, especially poor countries that can't afford to lose the financial assistance that they get from the US, for example. It was shameful, I thought, what was going on, when we were trying to get the resolution negotiated. I was on the phone with some of the African negotiators through that process, and they were saying that people were being bullied in the hallways, financial aid packages were being threatened by US State Department operatives, along with, their jobs as ambassadors. So it's really,
and
embarrassing.
Embarrassing. So the politics that Justin was talking about also there in the international human rights realm, and perhaps worth mentioning, you were working with a group of African nations in support of the call for an independent commission of inquiry, and a number of European nations kind of stuck by the United States. So perhaps a racial undertone under all of that.
Yes, and I mean, it was racial undertone, but also what race is meant in the international community writ large, and the development of it. I mean, African nations, many of whom are the poorest in the world, and they're the ones who can't afford to go up against the big money, countries like the U.S. So there's a lot to be corrected and to work against on a global level. Working for equality on the global level can inure to the benefit of working for equality in the domestic context.
And that's where I'd like to go next, shifting back to the domestic scenario. And a question I'd like to pose to everyone on the panel, and let me start with you, Nicole Austin Hillary. What reforms are most needed in order to ensure protection of human rights for African Americans in particular, for communities of color in general, within our criminal justice system here at home?
We need a reform agenda that does more than scratches the surface. And I'll give you an example. Right now, as we hear about efforts such as the 8 Can't Wait, and we hear what local law enforcement agencies are doing internally to address some of these issues, we hear them talking about what I call changes to mechanisms. We hear them talking about things like, let's ban chokeholds, let's ban no-knock warrants. Well, of course we should ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants. That's easy. That's the easy stuff. That's common sense in terms of how you humanely treat people. But what we need to really be coalescing around is the larger conversation of systems changes that really help to strengthen and empower communities. So what we're talking about within Human Rights Watch, and we actually are going to be releasing something we're calling Human Rights Watch's 14 Principles for Police Reform. It talks about dealing with the communities and asking them what they want and need most. What we've learned from our research is that communities are telling us we need our governments, our local governments, to divest and reinvest in terms of how they spend money. We have done and been on the ground in Tulsa, Oklahoma for several years, and we've done considerable research there. And what brought us there was the killing of Terrence Crutcher by a white police officer. And what we wanted to find out was, why is this happening in Tulsa? What is the disconnect between police and community? And what we found working with partners on the ground is that they are not getting the services and support they need from their local government, that they, instead of putting money into transportation and improving the schools and improving housing, they are putting money into militarizing the police and into giving the police more tools that they can then use to subjugate members of the African American community, where they are actually targeting their efforts. So if we really want to talk about the kind of change we need, we have to talk about creating those kinds of changes and putting money into those kinds of reforms. Again, in Tulsa, sticking with the Tulsa example, we saw that Tulsa was spending more money on police than they were spending on transportation, housing, and education combined. Well, to me, that doesn't make sense. If you were, for instance, giving communities the kind of public transportation they need so that they can get to work, earn an income, take care of their families, then you will have fewer members of the community who, say, for instance, are driving on a suspended license or driving on suspended tags, which, because you target those communities for those kinds of low-level offenses, means you are locking up more Black and brown people, you are increasing mass incarceration, all for really little to nothing. That's not really fighting crime. That's using communities to really help buffer the coffers of the local government. But if you look at those bigger systemic changes and fulfilling those bigger systemic needs, then you have a cyclical effect. You have a cyclical impact wherein you are improving the community, strengthening the community, and making it less probable that members of your community will be engaged with the criminal justice system. So that's how the conversation needs to go right now. And those are the kinds of reforms we need to be talking about. I am up to here, Allison, on just talking about, again, those small scratch the surface changes. We need those, but they should be a part of a larger effort to reform these systems, and part of a larger effort, again, to divest resources away from strengthening police in ways that they don't need to be strengthened, and instead strengthening the communities in the ways that will make them stronger and, frankly, empower them so that they are running communities the way they believe they need to be run.
You make a compelling case.
Yeah. In fact, I just got 2 points to add there. First of all, it's stunning how much these cities are spending on the civil suits brought by people who've been brutalized by police. Okay, so just an example. New York City in 2017, a couple of years ago, spent over $300 million to pay for, civil suits brought by people who've been brutalized by police. Just think of what that $300 million could do if invested in communities instead. But the other thing I think that is really a huge problem here is impunity. I mean, we have got to find a way to make sure that those people who are committing these human rights abuses in front of our faces, in front of cameras, et cetera, actually get prosecuted and convicted and sent to jail or whatever in ways that are commensurate with what they have done, and not the whole pattern of impunity that has existed. And I would say that just 2 quick other points. One is to refer back to what Justin said earlier about the unions. There's got to be a way to break the power of the unions. And I'm usually a supporter for unions, so let me say that. But these police unions are not just in, for protecting their jobs and getting an opportunity to do what's right. They are putting enormous pressure on cities to allow them to have impunity for these kinds of human rights abuses. We got to stop that.
Mm-hmm. So ending impunity for rights violations by law enforcement, redirecting resources, and as you were making that compelling case, Nicole, it struck me that the economic and social rights that we spoke of earlier in the hour, the rights to housing, to education, to jobs, to healthcare that aren't fully recognized in the United States, that those are part of what's at issue. Those are the exact needs that could be served by redirecting some resources. And is the reform that you described, is that what is sometimes named under the banner of defund the police, that redirection of resources?
Yes, it is. And you know, can we deal with that for a second? I don't know if you all dealt with it earlier, Allison, but
We haven't.
I'm getting so many questions, and I'm sure Gay and Justin are too. You know, because I'm doing a lot of talks right now, as we all are, and there are people who are saying to me, are you really saying we shouldn't have police and we should take away money from the police? And I'm saying to them very pointedly, what we are saying is that we have as a nation empowered the police in a way that is destructive to communities. And that the way to undo that harm is by shifting how we have empowered them. And we have empowered police forces through money. And so, yes, when people are saying how we have to change and tear down policing as it exists, that's really what people are saying.
Yes.
People coming to me saying, are you really saying we should do away with the police? We are saying that we have to do this differently, and that resources are needed more readily in the communities. Because if you ask people what they want, which is what is at the heart of our research, we go to the communities and we ask the community partners, what do you want? And what they tell us is, we want clean and safe housing. We want safe water. We want our children to have quality education. We want public transportation that works for us, that allows us to access the best jobs where we can make the most money and take the best care of our children. We want healthcare. We want community healthcare so that hospitals are in our communities within walking distance, within a 1 bus ride distance. That's what they want. And those are the things that are going to make communities stronger. And so what our lawmakers need to be investing in are those things that will make communities stronger. Militarizing the police, giving them more tools by which they can target and harm Black and Brown communities is not doing that. And that is what people are saying they have had enough of and what needs to end.
Thank you for that. And we have just 3 minutes to close. We knew an hour was going to go quickly. I want to invite everyone to leave a parting thought, a concluding word, perhaps a call to action on how people can take what they've heard today and act on it. Justin Hansford, let's start with you for a brief conclusion.
Well, it was an honor to be on this panel with such amazing human rights lawyers and activists that I look up to. My call to action is for everybody to understand that we're facing not a civil rights crisis, but a human rights crisis right now in the United States. Make sure that you go out and protest. Make sure that you go out and speak to your representatives and demand that they do the things that Nicole and Gay have mentioned. Divest from the police, invest in the community. I particularly think that includes reparations as well. And I think that it includes reparations not just for slavery, but for police violence and the human rights violations that are happening right now every day to our friends and neighbors in our community and our families. So be out there, be involved. If you're a civic leader, use your power to support financially and politically all of those organizations that are doing that work, and put your money where your mouth is.
Gay McDougall, your brief closing word for us.
Well, I would say ditto to what Jason said. I say to, all of the young people, because so far it's mainly young people, please keep being out there in the streets, because it is the only thing, unfortunately, that moves this conversation forward. But I would say, every other demographic, find a way to get out there with them. I'm working with faith leaders, right now to get them out into the streets. I love the moms for whatever in the streets in Portland. We've all got to find a way to support the Black Lives Matter movement, and then to translate that support into real change.
Nicole Austin Hillary, you have the last word.
I would only say this, and I've been telling people this far and wide when people say, what can I do? I'm asking everyone to use their own personal bully pulpit to make a difference. Part of the problem that we've had in this country around the fight for rights is that people often wait for somebody else to do it. You still hear people say, when are we going to get the next leader? When is there going to be another Martin Luther King? And I keep telling people, there won't be. The time is now for each of us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how can I show up? And you show up given the resources that are at your disposal, and you show up right where you are. You have opportunities to talk to your neighbors, your community groups, your school, your alumni organization, your sorority, your fraternity, whatever it is going to be the power of collective engagement that is going to be the difference that we see at this moment. And so I would urge people to show up and stand up right where you are.
And for those viewing our program today, you'll have one place you can start to do that in the online discussion that flows out of this conversation right there on the same website where you found this event today. I want to close by thanking our amazing panelists, Gay McDougall, Justin Hansford, Nicole Austin Hillary. This has been an incredibly illuminating and inspiring and important conversation. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.